Joining me now is Ed Pilkington. He is the chief reporter for the Guardian newspaper US on Guardian.com. Ed, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
Now, Ed, I want to talk about both both pieces that you wrote. I guess it was last week. One on the State Policy Network, and the other on ALEC. Let's start with ALEC. We've talked about ALEC on this program, but just give us, just tell us a little bit about who or what ALEC is, and what they've been up to for almost now 30 years.
Yeah, 30 or even 40 years now. The way I see it, I like to see them as a sort of dating agency. ALEC brings together, on the one hand, overwhelmingly Republican elected politicians, legislators at state, local level. And it puts them in a room with representatives of some of America's biggest and most iconic companies. And having brought them together, it allows them to sort of decide between themselves what they want to do at state legislature level in terms of the next session of passing laws. And therefore it gives corporations a direct access into the political process.
And this American Legislative Exchange Council, as its full name, is like you say, is now I guess they're celebrating their 40th anniversary, but they really only in the past couple of years gotten any attention. What was it that, I mean, how was it that they were operating so quietly for so long?
Absolutely. I mean, the strength of ALEC, I think, largely came from the fact that it was operating beneath the radar. For, good part of 35, 37 years, they were largely unknown, not talked about. Because they had charitable status, they still have charitable status, they're able to not disclose the donations, where they receive their money from. And it was actually in 2011 when the first big dump of leaked documents happened. In that case, it was a huge list of model bills. This is what ALEC does. It brings legislators together with corporations, and they frame model bills, which are business-friendly pieces of legislation that are drafted by ALEC and then are taken to state legislatures around the country and turned into law. And in 2011, a huge dump of model bills from ALEC were made public, and before that we hadn't known what they'd been doing. But then we suddenly had an insight into what activities they were pursuing. And last week, the Guardian had the sort of part two, in a way, which was another huge dump of documents, internal documents from ALEC, which sort of brought us up to date 2 years later after the initial leak. It shows us the condition that they're in, and actually the fact that they're struggling financially, and they're having a bit of trouble keeping hold of their big corporate members.
I mean, it's interesting, and I want to get to this second dump, but it's interesting because in some ways they are a victim of their own success, and part of the reason why I think they made such a splash in 2011, these documents, was that in the 2010 elections, where we saw Republicans take over a lot of state houses, a lot of governorships, and we started to see similar bills cropping up. And for the first time, in many respects, getting passed because of that wave election in 2010. This is what brought so much of that attention. And one of those bills that they were able to pass turns out to be one that has brought them, I guess, a lot of bad luck when it comes in terms of funding and in terms of membership, and that is the Stand Your Ground laws.
Yes, absolutely. When Trayvon Martin died in February 2012 in Florida, the massive nationwide furore that provoked actually sucked ALEC into it. Now, contrary to some public comment, ALEC was not responsible for the Florida Stand Your Ground law, because that was the very first law of its type passed in the country, and it was done by Florida state politicians under their own auspices in 2005. But what ALEC did do is it saw that Florida law, it picked it up, It turned it into one of their model bills where, as I've said, legislators to come together with corporations and agree to push this bill out. And then it passed it all around America. And we're now, in 2013, we now have something like 26 states with some form of stand your ground law on their books. And to some degree, each of those pieces of legislation based on an ALEC model bill. And as a result, ALEC got sucked into the whole Trayvon Martin furore after the 17-year-old was shot by a neighborhood watch guy down in Florida. And what we learned from our documents last week was really the fallout of that and how serious it's been for ALEC. I mean, they've lost maybe up to 60 of their major companies who are members of ALEC, dropped off and actually refused to be members anymore post-Trayvon Martin. And one of the documents we obtained was titled Prodigal Son Project. And it listed 41 of those companies, including some of the biggest in the country, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, Walmart, General Electric, Amazon, the list goes on. And under the title Prodigal Son Project, it made clear that it wanted to woo those companies back and bring them back into the fold. So it was interesting. We're starting to see the fallout of public attention and what it can do, what sunlight really, what the combination of the hard work of watchdogs like Center for Media and Democracy and Common Cause, who've done a lot of sterling work trying to find out what ALEC's doing using freedom of information laws, and the press, people like us at The Guardian, trying to put a light on an organization that for 40 years has been living beneath the radar.
And this Prodigal Son Project, which I love the name, it's not only looking to get these corporations back into the fold, is it also geared towards, I know you reported that they have lost almost 400 state legislators from its membership. Are they trying to woo those people back in as well?
Yes, I think so, although there was less overt within the documents that we obtained. There's no sort of direct reference to that. But yes, the figures of attrition, they use the word attrition actually in their documents, is they've lost about 400 legislators since 2012, since Trayvon Martin died. And that's out of about a peak of 2,200. So they're now down to about 1,800 legislators from around the country at state level. And on the business side, they've lost about 60 members, bringing them down to, I think the figure's around 220 or something like that. So the main numbers are on the public, the elected politician side. But the corporate losses are probably the most serious for them because overwhelmingly, something like 98% of their funding comes from either big businesses or the big founding bodies, the funders of right-wing causes such as, the ones we all talk about all the time, the Koch brothers, the Searle Foundation, and other big sort of private foundations that are backing them.
Before we get into some of the other documents, what does that tell us? Obviously, sunlight disinfects this stuff, but what does it tell us also about the sort of the corporate mentality and the way that they do their cost-benefit analysis in this situation?
Sorry, Sam, the line is bad. Do you mind saying that again?
Oh, okay. So what is that? And I want to get into the other documents in a moment, but what does that tell us in terms of the analysis of the way that these corporations who have decided to no longer fund ALEC, what does it tell us about their cost-benefit analysis when it comes to a group like ALEC?
Sure, that's a very interesting question. And I think it's quite revealing, really, because what it shows is that I think corporations are more vulnerable than we assume they are. Often you'll read the kind of media that covers big multinational companies, and there'll be almost an element of despair that here are these huge companies that can never be touched. They're beyond any public or democratic control. They're sort of monolithic and all-powerful, and you'll never reach them. And yet here we find a number of America's biggest and most powerful companies are actually incredibly sensitive to public pressure and public attention. And although it's quite clear that over the years ALEC has given them a great deal, has helped their bottom line a huge amount by giving them legislation that helps them, whether it's reining back government regulation or reducing corporate taxes or letting them pay, below subsistence wages by holding down the minimum wage. A lot of those things ALEC has been responsible for. So ALEC has given them a lot, but it did so in secret. As soon as it becomes public, those corporations start to get really quite uncomfortable. And it shows the power, I think, of hard work on the behalf of public watchdogs, combining with media to inform the public. It's sort of the power of public information and a knowledgeable and informed readership, I think.
And so let's start to talk about some of the other documents that you you have found access to, and let's start with the notion of, do we think, and I don't know if you can glean this from there, but do we think that the scaring off of those 60 funders, is that going to have an appreciable effect on what ALEC works on? In other words, is it going to change their agenda at all? Or is this simply now those 60 companies are still going to gain the benefits of what ALEC is doing, but they're no longer going to fund it?
Well, I think we are already seeing a shift in direction from ALEC, which, again, I think talks to the power of public information. Because in the wake of Trayvon Martin and all these corporations dropping off, they actually closed some of their most powerful task forces. They call them task forces, and they're essentially sort of specialist areas in which they operate. And they cover all the sort of top bases of conservative thinking, whether it's energy policy designing to hold back regulation on climate change pollution, or education designed to forward privatization of education, or tax policy to get lower taxes, or healthcare, where they're trying to hold back, they're actively opposing Obamacare and trying to reduce Medicaid. Those are their obvious areas, and they have a task force for each one, and within each task force they bring together legislators and businesses. And post-Trayvon Martin, they actually closed one of their most important task forces, and that was the one that created the Stand Your Ground law in the first place. And it also, importantly, created voter ID laws, which are the laws that make it more difficult for people, particularly African Americans and poorer Americans and elderly Americans, to get to the ballot boxes and cast their vote. So ALEC backed away from that because they obviously got a lot of pressure from their corporate members saying, look, we don't want you to get involved in controversial social areas. Stick to the main ground, which is economic, which is low wages, low taxes, that helps our bottom line, that keeps our profits up. Forget all the other stuff. And so they're pulling out of these areas, but it's important to note that having pulled out of the area of Stand Your Ground and voter ID laws, they've done nothing to help clean up the mess that they helped create in the first place. What do I mean by that? Well, Stand Your Ground laws, there's still 26 states or so with Stand Your Ground laws on their books, as I said earlier. And voter ID laws, there's more. There's maybe 35 states with voter ID laws on their books, a lot of which were framed with ALEC's help.
So you also found documents relating to the Jeffersonian Project. What is that? That seems to be the biggest sort of change that ALEC is making, in part because of funding, but also in part because of investigations.
Yes, I think probably more on the funding side in the sense of their tax relationship with the IRS. What they've done is they've actually legally set up a side organization called the Jeffersonian Project. Now, this isn't unusual for institutions to do this. ALEC itself is a 501c3, meaning they're a charity organization that is supposed to do education. They're only allowed to do very, very minimal lobbying. In fact, ALEC says it does no lobbying at all, which I think would make a lot of your listeners raise their eyebrows, because if coming together with business and politicians and framing legislation that then becomes enacted around the country, if that's not lobbying, what is lobbying? And which is actually, a genuine question. I think there's a lot of discussion about that very question at the moment in America. But nevertheless, they claim they're doing no lobbying, they're doing nothing wrong. But they are, and we've seen legal letters in the documents that we obtained, which makes it clear that they are. They're worried going forward that the IRS may look into them and say, hang on a minute, what you're doing is much more like lobbying than you've said it was to us. and you're breaching the spirit of charity law, which allows them to be entirely tax exempt. So by setting up a new group called the Jeffersonian Project under a slightly different status, the 501c4, they will be allowed overtly to do much more lobbying. Up to about 50% of their work could be overt lobbying. And I think they're hoping by doing that to skirt around IRS tax laws that allow them to be tax exempt. It allows them to keep the identity of their donors private, in other words, not make it public. And it allows them to do their business much more above ground, which I think they want to do now, to become slightly more public about what they're doing.
My favorite line in your piece is a letter that is included among the documents from ALEC's lawyer, Alan Dye, who says, quote, "Though we do not believe that any activity carried on by ALEC is lobbying, the IRS could disagree." That, I think, right, is sort of a classic lawyer speak there of, we got this problem, but nowhere in print are we going to admit that we've actually been engaged in it. So let's also talk about there was a draft agreement that was prepared for a board meeting in which legislators, I should say, were required to put the interests of ALEC first. Just talk about that briefly. It's just sort of stunning.
Yeah, now this was one of the documents we obtained. It was a sort of draft, and it set out the sort of duties of state chairs of ALEC. Now, each state will have a sort of ALEC outpost, and it will be chaired by a very, very senior elected politician from that state. Almost certainly going to be a Republican, because more than 80% of ALEC's legislator members are Republican. And so a senior Republican will be helping ALEC do its work within the local state. And this draft agreement contained lots of sort of things that they would be expected to do. And one of them was a line that said it was expected that a state chair would put the interests of the organization first. Now, ALEC said to us before we published that they did not go ahead and turn that draft into an official document or any sense of pledge. But I think it's kind of still revealing, it kind of reveals a mindset which goes to the heart of what ALEC is, which is, a direct input for corporations, for big business, a direct input into the political process. And, that sentence suggested that in that mindset, elected politicians should put the interests of ALEC, i.e. this interface between big business and politics, before the interests of the very people who had elected them. Which, I think that goes to the heart of why some people are quite concerned about what ALEC is doing, particularly as, up till recently it was all being done in secret.
And I wonder, too, if that wasn't also, or that edict wasn't at least contemplated, not just in terms of superseding what would benefit their constituencies, their voters, but also, I would imagine, other groups that may have sway on these elected leaders. Grover Norquist's group, or the Republican Party, or whatnot. I mean, it's sort of an interesting dynamic that they're trying to set up. Even if they ultimately didn't include that in there, they certainly were contemplating it.
Right, and you don't need that sentence, that pledge, which, as ALEC made clear, has never happened. You don't need that to give businesses direct sway over legislation, because that's what ALEC is doing anyway. I mean, that is its very structural foundation. Because inside the closed rooms of these task forces, where they meet 3 times a year, most recently, just last week in Washington, D.C., before that in Chicago in August, 3 times a year they bring hundreds of legislators into these task force rooms, which are closed to the public. None of the press have been able to get into them. And they sit them down with representatives of these huge businesses. And although many have dropped off, they still got some of the biggest companies in America as their members: ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Altria, the tobacco giant, AT&T and Telecom. So they got some huge companies still with them. And they bring them together, and in that room, the legislators and the corporate representatives have an equal vote, and it actually is a vote. Corporate members get to vote on what legislation they want to see done. And, for me, that goes to the heart of why this is a really unusual group, because, let's take a step back and say there's nothing wrong with interest groups of any nature expressing what they want to see done in a state legislature in terms of new laws. Unions should have their say. Employers should have their say. Big businesses should have their say. Local neighborhood groups should have their say. Everyone should be able to have their say on an elected politician and say, this is what we want. But at the end of the day, it has to be the elected politician who takes the decision based upon what they think their electorate wants them to do, because that's who they're representing. They're not representing anybody else other than the people who voted for them. But this ALEC system totally twists that, because it gives corporations an actual vote over the legislative process. Indirectly, because ALEC has to frame a model bill, and then it has to take it to the state legislatures. But, every year, maybe 130 model bills are being put forward in terms of state legislatures, and a sizable proportion of those model bills will become law.
And one of the last documents that you also you highlight in your piece is that ALEC is considering sort of getting into the sort of gambling regulation industry, I guess, which is interesting, particularly in light of the announcement a couple of weeks ago that Sheldon Adelson, a very big donor to Republican causes over the past couple of years, is going to start to fight online gambling. Where give me a sense of where that fits in there.
Well, again, I should say that ALEC, who to be fair to ALEC, engaged with us quite substantially. We had an email exchange before we published that, in which ALEC put its point of view, and I think that in itself is new. They are making more of an effort to respond and to be engaging with public voices like our own at The Guardian.
Pretty soon, Ed, you'll be able to go to one of these retreats, maybe.
We'll see. We shall see. How far is it going to go? I mean, that is an interesting question. I don't know how far it's going to go. They say they are committed to more transparency, and I think so far they have been showing steps in that direction. But we'll see how far it goes. But in that exchange, they made it clear that they had not adopted that proposal. It was a proposal, but it didn't go further than that. They have not adopted it as ALEC policy. It will not become any model bills. But I think it revealed, they have funding problems because they've lost all these corporations post-Trayvon Martin. They have a hole in their budget that our documents revealed, which is anything up to about a third of their regular income. They need to make it up, so they're looking for new areas where they can attract big corporate donors. And the proposal made it clear that there's something like $37 billion every year being generated by the gambling industry, and huge companies there, and a lot of big policy issues like regulation of internet gambling, regulation of casinos, that ALEC could profitably, that was the point. It was profitably they could get involved in. Now they decided not to do that, so that I think shows that they remain very sensitive to the argument that they should not get engaged in the most controversial social issues. They should stick more to the economic side. But it did reveal a way, again, a mindset where they pursue policies where they think big companies are concerned about certain issues, and therefore their membership may flow from that, and following membership comes finance.
And so while I guess it remains to be seen if ALEC will continue this spiral down and if their influence will wane in any way. But last week you also did a piece on the State Policy Network, which in some ways seems to be a similar type of organization, or fits into the sort of the right wing machine in a slightly different way. Tell us who is the State Policy Network, and where do they fit into this greater picture?
Yeah, well, with the State Policy Network, we're sort of where we were with ALEC in 2011, and that we know very little about them. They really have been underneath the radar. and yet we're starting to learn a little bit more about them. And they're very, very similar to ALEC. In fact, there is a line of thought that they were created by ALEC a few years ago. I haven't confirmed that myself, so I can't say that for certain, but they came from similar roots. They have totally the same kind of preoccupations, whether it's reducing taxes, holding down wages, fighting the role of unions, keeping down public pensions, privatizing education, holding back Obamacare, and also fighting climate change, pollution regulation. So all the same, absolutely the same obsessions, you might call them, as ALEC, but they have a different route. If ALEC does it by bringing legislators together with big business in a room and get them to sit down and vote together on what state legislatures should be doing in the next session, what SBN does is to wield the power of ideas. And SBN runs a network of 62 different state-based think tanks. They call them think tanks. They call them free market think tanks. And those think tanks engage in what they call research. Now, that may be a term of art because they too are charities. They're meant to be education bodies, and they're not allowed to do anything but a tiny amount of lobbying. So therefore, they talk about research. Well, actually, what they're doing is campaigning for a change in the law in states around the country, and all those things I talked about, reducing taxes, privatizing education, and so on. So they throw up reports that are talked of as research papers, and those reports then lead to media campaigns and actual campaigns in the state legislatures and try and influence, enactment that way, and trying to change the law that way. And, like ALEC, they're changing people's lives. This really affects people on the ground, whether it's through their wages or their pensions or their union rights or their schooling of their kids or whatever it is. It's changing their lives.
And it seems that in some ways what they do is they build relationships with politicians who may be amenable to certain policy goals that they have in any given state. They build these relationships and then they develop essentially studies, I'm using air quotes here, and policy papers that then can be used by those politicians. You outline at least a proposal that speaks to Chris Christie, and we should also say to Rahm Emanuel in his desire to cut pensions for public workers in Illinois. This seems to be, at the very least in Illinois, this project seems to be going forward. Tell us about that dynamic.
Yeah, what we obtained was copies of 40 different grant proposals coming out of 35 different states, which were from these individual state-based think tanks, so-called, each one with a different ambition. And it was interesting that, particularly as we're talking about lobbying, whether these groups are lobbying or whether they're doing academic research, as they say they are, that a couple of them homed in on prominent politicians. In New Jersey, they homed in on Chris Christie, and in terms of Chicago's pension crisis, they homed in on Rahm Emanuel. Now, The Guardian has obtained no evidence that those two politicians were even aware that this work was being done. But both of those grant proposals made clear that they wanted to influence those politicians and to wield influence with them, to use their leverage in order to change the law in each local place. In the case of Chicago, to change the pension laws, and in the case of New Jersey, it was in some other area of public policy. And again, that's sort of raising questions about what is this? Is this lobbying?
Right. I was going to say, how is that different from what a lobbying outfit would do? We know that politician X may be amenable to this or wants to get to, place Y. Let's give them some materials that will bring by their place so that they can make these arguments.
Yeah, and I think that's, that goes to the heart of what's going on here. It's what I find interesting about both ALEC and SBN is that they're doing this in the name of federalism. I mean, we talked earlier about ALEC wanting to set up a side group called the Jeffersonian Project. Well, they're using the name Jeffersonian, at least in part because of Jefferson's belief in federalism. And so they're saying, let's rein back federal government, and let's unleash the power of the state politician. And yet, having done that, they're then trying to stamp on it, whether it's through, think tanks producing these research papers, or whether it's ALEC, bringing politicians together with big companies. They're trying to impose a centralized, one-size-fits-all imprint of what they want to be done in these state legislatures, so that the same things are now happening in Nebraska as are happening in Illinois or are happening in Maine. Exactly the same laws are being passed. In the case of ALEC, based on exactly the same language within the legislation, or in the case of SBN, based on research that is sort of shared between these think tanks, with SBN acting as a central clearinghouse, and then using either the power of corporate money or the power of ideas to influence local politicians into going along with this centralized project.
And finally, what do we know about the funding of the SPN and its sort of leadership? I mean, where is it? I mean, it sounds quite decentralized, but there must obviously be some central players to this. I mean, and who's funding it?
Right, and it's funny with these groups because you don't have to look that hard to find exactly the same names cropping up. As you say, there are 62 different think tanks, and each one will have their own funding sources. But SPN acts as a sort of umbrella, sort of coordinating point between all of them. And they, in our documents that we obtained, they were gathering together lots of grant bids from each of these think tanks, and they were passing them for funding to the Searle Freedom Trust. Now, people who follow this area of right-wing funding know Searle, or some people call them Cyril, know them very well. They came out of a huge business empire called C.D. Searle, which was a pharmaceutical group, produced NutraSweet. And the private wealth of billions that came out of that empire was put into a foundation, which now funds to the tune of $15 million a year, primarily conservative causes. So SPN was passing these proposals for campaigns, essentially political campaigns around the country, to Searle for funding. And, the other names that you hear all the time crop up as well, the Koch brothers, other foundations, groups of prominent billionaire business people who have made their money maybe in the 20th century and now using it to act as incubators for conservative campaigns and causes, including, among others, the Tea Parties.
Well, this was Ed Pilkington, some really great reporting. I appreciate your coming on and talking to us about both the SPN and ALEC, and thank you for your time today.